So welcome to the Boise River Enhancement Network Riverside Chat. Today we are talking with Marve Griffith. He's with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and so he has a presentation for us, and then there should be time for questions at the end. So Marve, I'll stop sharing and then you can start your presentation.
All right, so my name is Marve Griffith, and I work for the Army Corps of Engineers. And I currently reside in the Regulatory Division of the Army Corps. So what that means is I'm kind of in maybe what most people are unfamiliar with of one of the many missions the Corps has. You might be more familiar with Lucky Peak Dam, which is a Corps dam here at on the Boise River. It's one of 3 dams on the system. You might be familiar with some of our flood response work that we do. So we do emergency response for flooding and other options like that. We have a lot of missions. We do power team. You might know us from the lower 4 Snake River dams. Those are ours as well. So we do hydropowers and navigation as well. And more recently, you might be familiar with some of our planning studies, such as the Garden City General Investigation or the Boise River GI, which was studying the potential to increase arrow rock. So what some of you probably interact with more is regulatory, but a lot of people don't actually understand how we got to regulatory, what it is exactly we do. And so I'm kind of hoping to take the time today to kind of tell you what I know about what I do and kind of give you a little bit of history on why the Corps even is involved in implementing authorities that regulate waters. So that's kind of the snapshot. So again, my name is Marve Griffith with the Army Corps of Engineers. I've been with regulatory for about 10 years. How about now? Are you guys seeing the presentation?
Yeah, we can see it. I can see it.
Perfect. All right. So I'll get right to it. So, so I've been doing this about 10 years. I live in Boise. I'm over from Preston, Idaho, over on the eastern side of the state. Been here for quite some time. And I work for Walla Walla District. So you should be seeing the map of basically a dashed red line, which is our civil works boundaries for the Corps' civil works efforts, such as dams, planning, power, hydro, all that stuff. But then also in a different color is going to be the state of Idaho. So we have a couple of authorities where the Corps regulates activities within waters, and our boundary for that is the state of Idaho. And that really came about from the 80s. The governors got together and decided that amongst all the different Corps districts, they'd prefer any regulatory actions to just be limited to states. So it was more just for ease of implementation. So as you can kind of see, the panhandle for any dams like Libby Dam, that's actually Seattle district. You go down to the Bear River Basin, that's actually Sacramento district. We work over in Jackson Hole, which would be Omaha district for regulatory. So we got a little bit different boundaries, but for the work I do, it's for the state of Idaho. So we have a mission. Like most missions, they're generic and they're kind of vision statements. But it's to protect the nation's aquatic resources while allowing reasonable development through fair, flexible, and balanced permit decisions. And that essentially is just what we try to do. And that's mostly because in the work we do, we try to be not an opponent or a proponent, but just to be a fair, neutral party in evaluating proposals and projects. But the bigger question most people have is, why is the Army Corps of Engineers, who builds all the dams and does all the hydropower and manages all the locks and dredges all the ports, why are we also out running around the state issuing permits and reviewing projects for bank stabilizations and everything else? So hopefully you guys find this next a bit interesting. I find it interesting. The Corps of Engineers has been around since 1775. So originally established before the whole Declaration of Independence to start preparing for war. And since that time, Congress has tasked the Corps with whatever mission it needed done within waters, pretty much, primarily waters, but also roadways and other big feats like that. So back in 1890s, there was a huge effort to basically utilize the mode of commerce at the time, which was waterways. And Congress got together and passed what was called the Rivers and Harbors Act. And the mission essentially assigned to the Corps is to start improving upon the waterways to ensure that interstate commerce could occur and part of the connected federal nexus for across the state. So this is a long time ago. It was a really undefined effort at the time, but it originally kind of came to be because of a concern they found. Steamboats and railroads were building. The federal government was investing a lot of money into like these giant waterways. This is all basically East Coast still at the time, the major waterways, Mississippi east. And as they were doing all these improvements, states and local parties were just building bridges or other issues that were essentially eliminating the ability for anything to go. There's lots of accidents. There's a lot of conflict. So Congress got together in 1890, created the Rivers and Harbors Act. They signed that authority to the Corps, and it was a pretty minimal authority at the time. It basically was trying to keep people from filling and dumping in all the harbors, making them inoperable. So the Corps took this new authority and decided to start enforcing it. And the little anecdote here, early on 1892, so shortly after they were given the authority, they went around and had 50 indictments for dumping debris in the harbor. They then slowly started building upon this authority through litigation and identifying things that maybe weren't a direct effect to navigation, but those kind of passive effects. And so people originally as dumping, filling, putting all their trash in the waterways, but the Corps started utilizing that authority to ensure that those navigable waters were actually achieving their federally authorized purpose. So eventually it gets revised in 1899. And so this is when they've had a few years of implementation. Congress has determined that there's actually a huge need to start thinking beyond just the Corps' condition and capacity, which is the primary anchor of that original law, and start really thinking about what is the federal interest. So it originally kind of first starts out as starting to consider affluents. They started utilizing this pretty quickly because there were issues in the waterways. So this is before Clean Water Act, this is before any of us, all the other familiar laws were with. One example that was a successful effort was that the boilers on steamboats were corroding from a bunch of pollutants that were being dumped in the waterway. And so the Corps actually successfully asserted its authority to stop a chemical plant from dumping its just wastewater into the river because it was affecting the ability for interstate commerce. So the formal authorities granted, the Corps is tasked with basically keeping the navigation going through all the waters that they've been previously authorized to improve upon. So this essentially ends up being the beginning of the kind of cumulative effect and indirect effect concept that eventually starts building its way into more laws we're a lot more familiar with. So 1899, that's kind of where Rivers and Harbor Act is settled, authorities granted. Fast forward 34 years later from that, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. So now that the nation is starting to understand that there's also greater values beyond just commerce that we need to express and we need to essentially start considering. And a lot of these laws and regulations are starting to be an expression of the values that we're actually starting to place upon not only just the natural environment, but the human environment. So that gets amended in 58. And then the Federal Water Pollution Control Act is established in 1948, which further directs the Corps to consider effects of the decision on the natural environment. So we're slowly seeing a transition from the Rivers and Harbors Act, that anchor authority of a civil works entity to maintain the navigable capacity, to start assessing and considering the natural environment as a function and value that's worth protections. So you see all this kind of pushing through over about a 50-year period. And it starts building and building and building, and more national awareness, more issues of concern. And then ultimately what more people are probably familiar with is the Cayuga River Fire of '69, which essentially the river got on fire. It wasn't the first time it had, but it was a huge national event, kind of catalyzed the nation's interest in the kind of intrinsic value of our waterways and not just their physical capacity. And so that event gave basically the support to pass the Environmental Policy Act in 1970. And then shortly after that, in 1972, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which was still pretty minimal in its authority, is amended in 1972, becomes what is known as the Clean Water Act. At the same time, EPA is created, and they're actually tasked, I use the word overseer, I don't know if that's the best word for it, but they're tasked with being in charge of the totality of the Clean Water Act. And the Corps at that time is given the authority under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is the dredge and fill component. So we've had since 1890, the first time the Corps is given authority to actually do something about the waterways. 1899, it gets solidified in the final set of the Rivers and Harbors Act. 1848, Federal Water Pollution Control Act, that gives them a little bit more. It's still focusing on dumping and pollutants mostly. And then the Clean Water Act becomes the umbrella law for essentially 401, 402, 404, which are all different components, which essentially regulate waterways that have a potential to affect downstream navigable waters and therefore have an effect on interstate commerce. So the Corps has been doing this a long time. That's the summary right there. Is, we get a lot of flack for a lot of things. A lot of it's, warranted for sure. But as an agency, we've kind of been the original regulating agency for the nation for a long, long time. And as the Clean Water Act came to be, it kind of was a natural fit. We were already regulating these in waters. The scope and expansion happened to what was outside of traditionally navigable waters to waters of the United States. But the Corps already had a program in place. And so we took on Section 404, and then it continually refines. 404B guidelines came out in 1980. That was a law that helps the Corps determine how to implement the Section 404 program. A lot of litigation over the years, a lot of challenges, but ultimately the Corps, I think, is continually adapted and evolved to try to respond to the directives of Congress and the public and, do the best we can. So anyway, that's just kind of the short backstory on how the Corps got there. Anybody have any questions or thoughts on that part?
If you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Or you can write them in the chat.
Right on. Yeah, honestly, I kind of have a few different things I'm going to talk about, but more than happy to pause, go back, expand upon, or discuss. I've been kind of putting this presentation together for a little bit, but kind of the last few days when kids got sick got me kind of a little slower, so I didn't get it all polished out the way I wanted. So if there's things I'm kind of going through you're interested in, feel free just to flag it and be more than happy to go in further if I'm familiar with it. So essentially the whole point of that beginning part is the Corps has been doing this a long time. The nature of the work's always been the same. We've been tasked by Congress to implement basically whatever law it was, and those laws have basically been an expression of values that are growing over time. Right now, we have a couple of different laws, and we have a program. And so that's the program I work in. So I work in the regulatory division. This little kind of flow chart is kind of the best way I've found to kind of break apart the work that we actually do. What is the program, and how does it intersect with the public and the resources within the state of Idaho? So as you can see from there, there's essentially kind of three ways I think about it. Where we have authority, what we have authority over, and how do we implement that authority? And then those are kind of broken down further. So without any questions right now, I don't see anything in the chat necessarily, so I'll just keep going. So geographic jurisdiction, why and where we have authority. So Rivers and Harbors Act is still alive and well. Oldest federal environmental law in the US. We've been doing it for a long time. It's still pretty strongly anchored to the course, condition, and capacity of traditionally navigable waters. Unlike the Clean Water Act, which I'll get into next, it's a much more refined scope geographically. Waterways to be covered under Section 10 have to be designated by Congress, or they can be petitioned by the district, but they have to be approved at our division level. So Not all waters are determined to be a Section 10 water. Generally, the extent of them are anchored to some major navigational point, historical, present, or potentially in the future. And there's navigability studies that have to be done. The most recent one we did, what I want to say was 2016-ish, which was the Salmon River was designated a navigable waterway. The main stem salmon from the confluence up to River Mile 259. So for our area, there's only 10 in the state of Idaho right now. The closest one's going to be the Salmon and the Snake River up to River Mile 445.5, which is essentially the Ada Canyon line. So a lot of these were done a long time ago, and so the navigability studies are thin, or the records are hard to find. So for the Snake River, I'm not exactly sure why the river mile was picked. It might have just been an ease of determination. I'm not familiar historically if there was a specific port or anything right there. But some of these are pretty apparent. Bear Lake, obviously, it's an interstate water. Half of it's in Idaho, half of it's in Utah. It's obviously very navigable. Salmon River, Lower Snake, Clearwater, things like that. So we only have 10. They're defined by river mile, and we regulate a certain subset of activities, but I'll get into that a little bit later. The Clean Water Act, however, doesn't have the same refined designation of jurisdiction, and it changes over time. Sometimes, depending, administrations come up with new rules and they're proposed, and so what is covered under the Clean Water Act is a generic term of waters of the United States. Since I've been here, it's changed generally a few times, but there's always a few anchor components of it, and that's going to be your major waterways, tributaries to major waterways. Interstate waters are oftentimes, I think, pretty consistently always in there, and then wetlands, and the term is always adjacent, wetlands adjacent to the other waters. So we don't have a map, which can oftentimes be a frustrating thing. You can't just look at a map and say this requires a permit or not. But we do try to help the public understand as efficiently as we can the applicability of our jurisdiction. So here's a little cross section on kind of how we look at it. We have a couple of authorities just for an inland state, so a lot of the coastal authorities aren't there. But essentially, we work off of common terms. They're going to be ordinary high water mark and wetlands, right? And we have our own kind of process to determining them. It's very analogous to a lot of ways people are familiar with. It's just specific for our use. So ordinary high water mark and wetlands. Those are the kind of main things. So ordinary high water mark, that's a term most people are super familiar with. It's often synonymous with bankful, although they're different uses. So academic terms aren't necessarily always the same, but they're targeting the same thing. Essentially, that channel forming flow is going to be, periodic. Same with ordinary, it's going to be periodic. You see it on the landscape, you see it express itself. Ordinary high water mark is a term used for state jurisdiction as well, underneath the stream alteration program, as well as ownership of the riverbed for IDL. They might be defined differently, but we're all looking towards the same thing. And that's essentially, what is the ordinary high water? So our jurisdiction for Clean Water Act is going to be ordinary high water mark, and then as well as adjacent wetlands. So the Corps has developed over a long period of time an empirical way to delineate out what that boundary is. So wetlands are as far as value goes, really depend on the person. They're either giant mosquito breeding grounds or the most complex ecosystem you've ever seen. But regardless of what your view of wetlands are, we've created regional ways to delineate where they are. And so swamps, marshes, bogs, fens, those are always obvious ones. But out here, you get a lot more riparian areas. So riparian and wetland isn't the same thing, but they often intersect. You get a lot of wet meadow complexes, things such as that. But with our program, they must have the three indicators present to constitute a wetland, and that's going to be hydric soils, hydrology indicators, and hydrophytic vegetation. So we'll go on to the next part. So yeah, we've been working on trying to figure out what is a wetland for a long time. ERDIC are basically scientist group for the Corps. They have a few different shops. Their RAP shop works to develop manuals. Those are publicly available. They're very informative. We do it a little differently. You might find terms such as horizons and soils we don't utilize in here. We're talking the same thing, but the goal of our program isn't to necessarily study the wetlands as they are, but is to identify that line of jurisdiction. And so a lot of the discussion is really tailored to finding that point of transition, which is why you won't see in these manuals, the random sampling where you take your box plot and you throw it behind you and see where it falls and count your plants. We're really looking to find where the line is. Very targeted work. But they're really helpful manuals. There's a point for them. They're continually reviewed and updated to try to keep up with the best available science. So the first part of what we do is geographic jurisdiction. Those are anchored by two different laws, but they often overlap. So Rivers and Harbors Act, traditionally navigable waters, are also covered under Clean Water Act, but the inverse isn't necessarily true. Not all Section 10 waters or not all Clean Water Act waters would be Section 10, but they consistently utilize ordinary high water mark and wetlands. So in the summary on that, I guess you could say it's very much an aquatic resource-based program. So we have some anchor authorities. We've had them for a while. We've been doing work on them for a while. We kind of know where they apply, but not everything is necessarily regulated. That's one of the things about our program is it's not inherently a protection program where you can't do things. It's a regulatory program where we want to ensure that they don't have individually or cumulatively adverse effects. So what activities are we regulating? So for Section 10, it's pretty much most stuff. Work over, in, or under. So if you bore underneath to put in a new gas line and it's a Section 10 waterway, we would need to ensure that that doesn't have an effect at the course condition or capacity. Put a transmission line, same thing. You encroach across it. We would want to ensure that that capacity is maintained. So there's not really exemptions or anything to it. Docks, things such as that are often regulated to piers, things like that. The only exception for that, which gets a little interesting in the way laws play out, is that bridges are not. Those are actually specifically regulated by the Coast Guard under Section 9 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. So besides a bridge, the Corps would be the primary authority for any traditionally navigable water. So for the Clean Water Act, the Corps was delegated Section 404. You may be familiar with Section 401, Section 402. These are other authorities. 402, it's going to be associated with like affluent discharges from a wastewater treatment plant or multi-sector general permits, SWIP plans, if you're familiar with those. And they're looking at kind of that point source pollutant. 401 is going to be that, I might be mixing the term there, but it's going to be about like water quality, turbidity, things such as that come from discharges. So there's different roles looking at different things. So the Corps for Section 404 is about dredge and fill. The definition for dredge and fill is pretty consistent, but it's pretty vague. So the definition is replacing any portion of a WOTUS, Waters of the United States, with dry land, or changing the bottom elevation of any portion of a WOTUS. So that could be a lot of things. Common activities are going to be bank stabilization, culvert crossings, driveways, fill pads, and even in that center one, restoration projects oftentimes may require a discharge of fill. But it's kind of how you do it. So you look at that, that's a pretty generic term, but there's also a lot more to the law than just these two lines there. There's exemptions. There's exemptions to needing permits for agriculture, silviculture, maintenance, and other things. So discharges could occur, but they might not need a permit depending on why they're trying to do it. There's also, a level of what's called de minimis. So how you do it kind of matters as well. These are generic photos just to kind of highlight a point that wetlands can be anywhere. Not all wetlands are jurisdictional, and not everything needs a permit from us just because you want to go in there and do it. One of the main considerations is going to be kind of intensity. I think is a great word for demonstrating at what point maybe the regulation applies. You know, on the top few photos, you can see someone's mowing some, looks like reed canary or something like that. You know, that's not what we're in the business of regulating. But if they wanted to go in there with big equipment and scrape all and disturb all the soil or move all that soil and essentially eliminate the wetland from its existence, you know, that might need a permit. Same thing below, you know, on the left, you see, you know, a little bucket excavator scooping something up and dropping it right in a bucket. Well, the key term for that is going to be discharge, the discharge of dredge or fill material. So excavation may not. You know, ultimately, the Clean Water Act is trying to eliminate pollutants going in, fill being a form of pollutant. So how you do the work can matter. You know, if you scoop it out, clog culvert, and you take it and you go put it in an upland, that probably doesn't need a permit from us. However, if you're going to go in there and you're going to just kind of bulldoze it around and reshape the bottom elevations and maybe potentially change that bottom surface elevation or change it to dry land, that may need a permit. So a lot of it is anchored to intensity and the sequence of which you do work. Again, it's not a protection agency, it's a regulatory agency. So we do have bounds to what is actually covered. So we have our authorities. Those authorities apply to different tiers, specifically assigned for and put out on a map by river mile for Rivers and Harbors Act, and then determined over time or independently through the Clean Water Act for waters of the United States. And not all wetlands are jurisdictional, not all tributaries are necessarily jurisdictional. A lot are though. And then within those, we have certain activities that we're going to regulate, but not all activities. So now we're at, well, what do we look at? What do we do? So this is kind of how we're taking those two layers of jurisdiction and now applying it into what is a program. So first and foremost, we serve the public, right? I'm a federal employee. I'm a resource available to anybody as my time allows. There's a lot of needs out there, but we do our best to be available. And in that, we're not opponents or proponents of actions. We're not here to say things are good or bad. We're here to ensure they're compliant. And compliance is not subjective for us, it's pretty literal, although how that affects the public or people's perspectives can vary. And so we maintain a neutral position in the work we do to ensure that it's a fair and balanced program that allows for protections through regulation, but also isn't directing and over-asserting our authority. So we try to maintain an open door policy. We do site visits when we can. And if you have questions, you can always just call and ask. And we try to do our best to help you guys through that process. It can be complicated sometimes. We understand that. So we try to help provide, give that value added. The diversity of groups is across the entire board. If, single property owners, municipalities, federal agencies also need permits from us as well. And they scale from large mines or infrastructure projects to just a tiny little culvert across a little wetland area for someone's little dream house out there across the wet meadow. So we were able to scale accordingly to the need, and we try to kind of put that service forward. So I'll pause. Anyone have any questions or thoughts so far?
There's a few questions in the chat, and I can just read them here. So Dr. Tiedemann, his wasn't a question, but he would say that his guess was Swan Falls Dam is the reason for the limit of navigation on the Snake River. And then Luisa asked, as the climate changes and alters precipitation, amount and timing and the resulting runoff amount and timing, would the ordinary high water mark change?
Okay, yeah, I just opened the chat, so let's go back a bit and kind of talk through some of these. Swan Falls, maybe. It's a few river miles upstream. I think there's a landing, there's a fish and game kind of land right there, right below Swan Falls, out of the canyon, and a bridge. So maybe there was a community or something there. It might have been, who knows, Ada County didn't want it on their side, and so it stopped short. It's hard to tell. It was from a long time ago, but things such as dams are commonly a termini point for navigation, for sure. So you'll see that in some of our coastal districts, where there's basically an upstream port or an upstream dam that is the terminal limit for them. For the Salmon River, River Mile 259 is the city of Salmon. That would have been historically the point of commerce for navigation from Salmon down, the River of No Return stretches all the way to Port Lewiston area. So they're usually anchored to something that was an impediment. Obviously, you keep going further enough, you eliminate all the dams, and you go naturally. Shoshone Falls obviously would have been a navigational limit for the Snake River, but there's likely were a series along the way. So climate change and ever evolving hydrology to wetlands and waters. So ordinary is ordinary, and it changes over time. The more common way it changes is just through riverine processes. River of Olsa's big water year, it blows over. It now moves over 80 feet to one side of the bank, and a bunch of gravel deposits where the old thalweg was. Nobody does anything for a few years, and it resets. And so that's the new line of jurisdiction. But precipitation will affect wetlands as well. And so we apply things such as typical year, normal water year. We use as much data as we can when you're doing a delineation to see if you're in a dry year and maybe you're underestimating the indicators. Ordinary high water mark can get kind of tricky for two reasons. One, like in the Boise River, it's a regulated system. So a big water year may not express itself as a big water year through the system if they're able to shave peaks off enough. And so kind of working through what is ordinary in a managed system is a little bit more nuanced, but also relic indicators. So a great example of a high water is going to be your rack line, where all the shrubs and the sticks and the trash is at the trees, or your sedimentation line where all the dirt and silt is stuck in the bark of the trees. And the lag time between a big water year that would be above ordinary and the ordinary high water mark could be several years, where you might go out there and you're like, oh, wow, it's way up here. Look at all that trash and rack line up there. And so knowing your system and kind of knowing historically how the system is operating and when big water years were can help you refine down to what might be ordinary. But we, as a program, acknowledge that times change. I mean, even decadally, absent just potential effects from climate change through a larger area, there's just wet and dry decades. And so wetlands will expand and contract over time, and plant communities transition through, in and out. Fire has quick effects. So when you do delineations and what's occurred can make it kind of tricky. But we generally only, when we complete jurisdictional determinations, which is the formal determination that's a wetland or something is jurisdictional, they're only valid for 5 years, and that's one of the reasons why. It's because we acknowledge that things might change. And so, so we've kind of built into our program an acknowledgement that we're working with dynamic systems that won't be static forever. And you apply even like human influence for hydrology manipulation, and it can drastically change things. Irrigation influence is a huge component that's hard to tease out. We're flood irrigating a lot of stuff, but that's slowly reducing, and that's having an effect on where we might see wetlands expressing. So we have kind of built into the program to assess the conditions at the time to determine jurisdiction, but also consider that there are variabilities that go beyond just a seasonal scale. So hopefully that kind of answered it, Louisa. Do you have any other thoughts or questions on that? Okay, so going down the list, biggest misperception of the Army Corps by the public. So I work for the Corps, so you could easily say that my thoughts are biased. I really like the work we do. But I think one of the biggest misperceptions of the Army Corps for my program is that I would say the most of the calls is that people want us to be a protection agency. As in, wetlands might be present, we want you to stop everything. And that's, although projects may not be compliant and they may need to avoid and minimize further, and ultimately we can deny permits if after all avoidable avoidance minimization and compensatory mitigation and all these things that are available to the applicant to try to further reduce the impacts, we could determine that a term called significant degradation, which is a very high bar generally. We could deny a permit. However, most people, I think, are hoping that the Corps' program is an ability to just say no. And by being that neutral party, we're not necessarily there to run around and say, you can't do X. Planning and zoning and local communities, we're kind of the baseline protection, the Clean Water Act generally, and the communities, the state, and everyone else can build upon that as they so choose. So I think a lot of times the biggest misperception of what the Corps does is just because resources exist, there's nothing you can do. And that's not necessarily true. But we're always striving to ensure that whatever is done is the least environmentally damaging way to do it. Other than that, I think so understand the nuance between civil works and regulatory. I don't really view it. There's a difference. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm on the flood cadres, and we are just public servants working many, many missions. But a lot of times I think there's just a misunderstanding of how many authorities we have, and so we're often lumped into the same issues. But it's a very big program. Congress delegates and asks us to do a lot. And unlike a land management agency like BLM or Forest Service that may have a different type of authority, ours are very line itemed. You will do X, here's your money to do X. And so the way we're structured is different. And in being different, I think people presume that that we're just kind of these stewards that have control over everything, but we're actually achieving pretty specific missions as authorized by Congress. Let's see, Louisa. Does a rock pit that affects a permanent wetland need a permit? So let's see. Let's figure out what rock pit means, like a gravel extraction, I'm assuming.
Yes.
I'm assuming that from affecting could range from draining to lowering the water to completely removal. So it could. My least favorite answer, which is the most common answer I give everybody, is it depends. And I hate giving that because it doesn't answer many questions, but it does depend. How you do work somewhat influences on whether or not our authority intersects with an activity. So the discharge of dredge or fill material, that discharge, many pits around the Boise River do require a permit. And we go through and we work with them to avoid and minimize where they can and figure out what it needs to be compliant with whatever specific permit we're working through. But there are plenty that don't. There might just be a minor little component in there that they're willing to just excavate out and remove and not fill anywhere else in there. And maybe the whole pit is within areas that don't have a wetland in it. And if they excavated that out, inherently it might have an indirect effect. But without that initial federal impetus on there, we likely wouldn't assert jurisdiction on it. There's enough gray in all regulation, and the intent of usually gray is to address things you never considered. And so sometimes there might be avenues where we could, but generally a lot of activities that aren't inherently filling things in are in that gray area where they may or they may not. And that would also be on the presumption that it's a jurisdictional wetland. A lot of wetlands might be isolated or not adjacent. Just the distance from the body of water, or how that waters that supporting that wetland is originated, might make a difference on whether or not it's even within our geographic jurisdiction. So it depends, unfortunately. Great question, Tamsin. I will get to my final act, you might say. I'll blow us. This is going to be how best we can integrate enhancement activities into the Clean Water Act. So if that works for you, I'll hold on that one. So the next really main part on just really kind of who we are, what we do, how we do it, is that there's essentially two tiers to our program. So we have nationwide, regional, letters, permission, standard permits, and for the general public, that doesn't mean much. It's just a permit. Most programs issue a permit, and there isn't these tiers of how the permits are constructed or implemented. So it's kind of an unfamiliar concept. And I'll get to a kind of a quick breakdown on the different components of that for everybody. But essentially, nationwide permits is the majority of what we do. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the definition is change the bottom surface elevation or change it to dry land. Well, you know, on a literal sense, if you skip enough rocks into the river, you've changed the bottom surface elevation. And acknowledging that there is an intent to the Clean Water Act, and it's not just to touch everything, is to ensure that there's not significant degradation to our nation's waters. At the national level, we've created a series of general permits that cover 55 different categories of activities. And they're kind of compliance based. So we put conditions on them, we put thresholds in them, we put minimum standards in them. And we say, if you can design your project to fit in this box, it's considered categorically minimal. And some of those are tiered down so that you could look at the permit and you could say, okay, well, I can do all this, and it's a small enough activity, the impact's small enough that you don't actually need to submit an application to be compliant, as long as you did it in compliance with the conditions of the permit, which a lot of them are common conditions, you know, water quality, appropriate materials, indirect effect kind of stuff, where you just got to make sure. So in order to kind of assess the potentially extensive nature of federal involvement, we've created a streamlined effort to do that. And then regional permits are things the district creates for themselves to do the same thing as nationwide, and then essentially the big hitters, which are standard permits. When a permit applies, I say can include, because the majority of things aren't this extensive. Most things are pretty small, pretty minimal. There's a lot of bigger projects out there, but I would say the 90+% of our work is a general permit, and only, you know, a few, I don't know, maybe have like 20+ or so that are IPs a year, but we do a lot of work in the background. You know, at that point, we're ensuring compliance with Section 106 for historic properties. We're ensuring compliance with the Endangered Species Act. We're consulting with tribes. We're requesting water quality search. We're coordinating with Fish and Game and other parties. We're requiring compensatory mitigation. So there can be a lot. Most of the time, a project's impacts are small enough, they don't intersect with a ton, but they can. So essentially there's two tiers, and on the right-hand side is the bigger thing that I want to make sure that there's an understanding of nuance, is only for individual permits do we put out a public notice and request comment. So it's a subset of actions that we put out there and we want everybody's comments on. The way the nationwide permits are done is they're reissued every 5 years. So every 5 years we put out the permit and all the conditions and say, hey, tell us what you think. but we won't do that again until another 5-year cycle. So again, it's conditional based categories of activities that are conditional. So if you can meet all the conditions, you can be authorized. Applicable regulations still apply to those if they're there. But then the individual permit is for everything else. It's either too big or it's complex or it's an unusual type of effect, and there really isn't a category to fit it in, and so we will go out to public notice. And then we start doing individual determinations for some of the more complex components of our laws, such as NEPA and the guidelines, and also consultations and everything else. And so to one of your questions, one of the biggest misconceptions in Army Corps is that we're just not talking to anybody, that we're hiding, because we do a ton of work. It's in the background, and maybe, like, for example, the stream alteration program puts out for comment pretty frequently, and DEQ for every individual cert puts out a public comment. And so oftentimes I think people are presuming the Corps is actively not trying to engage with the public, but just procedurally within our authorities, there's only one tier of the program that actually does that. And so it's not necessarily, I think just people presume they're not. So in the background, we're still doing all this good work. It's just, it's not, it hasn't reached this large enough federal scope that we actually go through that public involvement process. Again, with the general permits, we do that every 5 years. So enhancement activities. So one of the things that we do, the goal is, there's a few lofty goals that have been thrown out there. There's a couple executive orders with no net loss, right? No net loss of wetlands, and those things are great. They're great values. They're inherently, it's a hard task to achieve, but the Corps' role in that is through compensatory mitigation. So the kind of last little bit of this, I'll just kind of talk about compensatory mitigation, but a little briefing on what compensatory mitigation is a project comes through, they're going to impact waters. They're jurisdictional, they need permits. Those waters are of such a magnitude, a certain dimension or size or a complexity or value that the Corps says, well, in order to actually be minimal, we need to ensure that those functions and values or that physical extent is offset to ensure that there's not continual degradation cumulatively. And so there's a few ways that compensatory mitigation expresses itself. You can purchase credits from banks, or you can do permitting responsible. Let's say you have, you got to cross a project for a residential development, so you have some impacts for wetlands, but you also have a bunch of other areas by the river, and you want to grade those down, expand the wetlands, and maybe enhance them. They're just like old meadow, you want to turn them forested. You can do things like that on site, you can do it off site. There's a lot of options available to the public. And they express themselves in usually restoration, essentially finding wetlands that are degraded and you want to improve upon, establishment, creating them, or enhancement, which is similar to restoration, but essentially you're taking a well-functioning system and you're trying to expand upon it. You can preserve, although honestly, that's not really a huge option here. There aren't as many wetlands as far as density goes out here. So we usually just see the other categories. So that's a requirement of our program. And one of the great things that's kind of going on in the Valley is a lot of enhancement work that's being proposed, is being presented. A lot of people are taking a lot of strong interest in the river, a lot of habitat enhancement, vegetation removal, trying to remove unwanted species and things like that. And so over, I don't know, I'd say the last year and a half or so, I think it's picking up speed, which is great. But there's a lot of lessons learned in achieving compensatory mitigation over the years that I'd kind of like to kind of end this with, and hopefully kind of share some things that might be helpful. A lot of lessons learned is a lot. So I've been doing this since 10 years. Whew. So it's been a while. And when I started, I was lucky enough to be part of a transition period where I got to work with a lot of people who, started the program in the state back in the late 80s and stuff. And, mitigation as a concept has always been around, but it has had to grow and be refined in a lot of what didn't work. And so one of the things that I've learned is it's actually pretty hard to have successful mitigation. It's really hard just to make things in 2 years and walk away and have it be perfect and never need to be touched again. It's just, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, particularly with wetlands. Wetlands are, it's easy to make things wet, but it's really hard to make it the exact amount of wet that you want. And so, and kind of talking with a lot of parties on this call today, one of the things that we do to help support successful mitigation is we have 12 elements of a plan. And so what I kind of been thinking about is like, well, how can the general public utilize a lot of the lessons learned, which is expressed in these 12 elements, in helping them plan out successful restoration projects? So on the left-hand side is going to be 12 elements. On the right-hand side is this kind of my layman's term on how I would approach that if I was going to start planning out like a vegetative enhancement or a restoration plan, because these are actually the things that we're diving into with an applicant and their consulting team or whoever, and we're asking these kind of questions to make sure it's successful. So the first one is baseline information. In order to compensate, we need to know what's there. So how I would transcribe that over to like enhancement work, and this is something that I think is probably the easier thing, is because it's observational. You go out there, you see a whole bunch of species you don't like. You're going to do an inventory. Well, what species are here that we are not favorable? What ones are here that we like? What is their age growth? Does it seem to be transitioning? Is there just a whole bunch of old growth Russian olives, but a whole bunch of understory of a different class or a different species? And so really looking and seeing what is there across the spectrum, not just the upper canopy, but also the new growth canopy and also the herbaceous class, can tell you a lot about probably what is an ideal species to target. So, and I say that because a lot of times over time, wetlands transition in class. There's a lot of old cottonwood galleries that have sagebrush underneath. So at one time they were very wet, but they're not anymore. And so to try to restart cottonwoods there would be probably an extensive amount of grading and earthwork to get down to whatever the natural elevation or flooding sequency would be. And so kind of looking through and really kind of looking upstream and downstream, not just at the target area that you don't like, and I shouldn't say don't like, but that is what you're hoping to remediate or enhance upon, is one of the things that I would highly recommend you just take the time to kind of observe. And not only just on the plant classes, but kind of look at the river. What's the river doing? What is this an eroding bank? Is a lot of the work to stop erosion? Is it passive? Does it seem like it's higher than the rest? Just really kind of paint that mental picture on what you think is going on in the reach. So the next thing we do in a compensatory mitigation plan is we figure out, okay, well, these impacts are proposed. How much do we need to be offset? And so an analogous question to that is, what exactly is it that we're wanting to achieve? So you found an area that you want to enhance, but what is enhancement? What does it mean to you? What are we wanting to do? Is it just a change in species? Is there a passive function? Is there a direct function, such as, is this a stabilization effort? We try and enhance through bioengineering, things like that. And actually kind of target, what is the linear feed of, is this going to express? What are we eliminating? What is the impact? And that would be kind of the second part of that. What are we losing? And how much time till we think success can occur? So the next thing we ask of anyone getting an application is, well, how are you going to do it? What do you want to do? And that would be an analogous thing too. What exactly is it that you want to do? And how can you actually do it? It's very easy to eliminate trees, but it's a lot harder to get them to grow. So figuring out, kind of breaking down between point A and point B, and just thinking, well, what would it, if this is where we are and this is where we want to be, and we can eliminate the noxious trees and we can plant these trees, well, what are we going to do to keep those other trees from going? And what will we think success will be? And that's really the harder part of most mitigation plans, is what is performance? What is successful? My experience, 30% die-off is pretty common, if not more, for anything that's woody and stem. Your first year or two, you can lose a lot of species just because it's a hot spring. All right, it ends up being a drier year, and the operators at the dam are so successful at shaving off peaks that it never gets wet like it did the year before. So thinking about how you can kind of, like, when is it successful for you? 80% cover, 50% cover, and then you apply that to the growth rate of the species you're thinking. And like, well, how long will it take for us to get there? What year should we come back and assess? Monitoring requirements. How will you know it's successful? Is the restoration have the resources and interest to have someone come back 5 years and do something about it? And so that's kind of like long-term management and adaptive management. So you have the resources and you have the excitement to get in there and do really good work. Maybe you got a grant, maybe you got some donations, maybe you got the interest and the volunteers are lined up ready to go to town. Well, what happens year two? And those are just questions to ask yourselves. Do you think you have the sustained involvement? Do you think you have the sustained resources to come back when the beaver comes through and eats them all? Do you have the resources to replant? Because you now have essentially eliminated what's there with the hopes of achieving something better. And so will you have the sustained resources, or maybe that's not a bad thing? Kind of go through what are potential avenues of failure. Do you have a garden hose from a neighbor's house in case it's a really hot summer? What do you guys, is that person always going to be party to this, or is it potentially going to be an issue for access in the future or something like that? So what if it doesn't work? Adaptive management, because the reality is most first efforts don't work well. In Pennsylvania mitigation plans, there's been some really interesting events that are ultimately successful, where the grading plan, a whole lot of money and efforts put into grading plan, and for some reason there's a little bit of an aquitard or just some kind of deadpan, and so hydrology's never met. They got to go in and deep rip it, and they got to get back in, and then it's established and it's great, but there was an assumption that wasn't accurate. So if it doesn't work, what can we do? And then financial assurances, I think, would be analogous to really how much interest long-term do we have? There's a lot of really good ideas that have a blink of resources at the time, and will there still be interest to keep it going until it's fully successful 5 years from now? And so I'll pause here. I want to open it up and just kind of do open discussion. But before I do that, let me answer Tamsin's question. So how you do it is whether or not a permit's needed. So if you're removing, cutting with hand tools, as long as you're not disturbing the soil and you're leaving the roots in there, historically and currently is not considered a regulated activity. What ends up being the kind of gray area is when the intensity increases. Now you start bringing in equipment to start chipping. You start bringing in little Toro stand behinds to kind of pinch and carry logs. You're bucking, you're stacking, you're keeping all that material there. That may need a permit from us, because even woody material can be considered a discharge of fill. So what I recommend is, I think we could maybe talk through tiers of non-reporting and just kind of be that your guidance, your kind of guidelines for, okay, does this project appear that it's non-reporting and compliant? If so, we don't need to apply. If we think it might not be, then we can just apply and we can issue permits pretty quickly for stuff like that. All right, so hopefully this has been interesting. I kind of ran through a lot in my head and talked the whole time, but I'd love to hear some more questions or comments or thoughts as well. So
Hi, Marv. It's Rob Tiedemann. I'd like to
How
know,
are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'd like to know some of the biggest challenges that you've witnessed or been party to along the lower Boise River, which is our predominant interest.
Yeah. So obviously, I should always throw an opening statement before I start talking. These are all Marv's thoughts and opinions, right? So I represent my agency. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, but I've also worked in this river for many years, and I've lived here for many years too. Some of the larger issues are migrating downstream. The river as a whole, I think, is pretty static in many reaches, but there's a lot of growth expanding through into Canyon County down to Parma. And it's not necessarily, I would say, an issue that, is good or bad, but there's opportunities for lessons learned as we see gravel operations and pits and stuff closing up shop around Eagle and start putting up shop down in Parma, and kind of what were the things that we think could be improved upon at your local level, such as overlay districts or setbacks or other things that are appropriately looked at and kind of placed upon at the local planning and zoning levels, ordinances, things such as that can maybe influence the long-term migration of certain intensity of industries that are going to move downstream. So that's one, and that's mostly just observing over time how the amount of intersection with development, the floodway, floodplain regulations, how that kind of works with gravel operations and pits and amenities and then development. But over time, I honestly feel that we're constantly improving. And I'll share with you something my predecessor, Greg Martinez, told me when I first started. And I remember kind of getting in a professional disagreement with an applicant about the amount of rock to be utilized, and was we were going back and forth on plantings and all this other stuff. And I remember Greg let me know, and he started, I think he was one of the first people in the state, and I would say the late 80s. And he said, well, remember when I first started, the question wasn't about bioengineering and vegetation versus rock. It was about whether or not cars and concrete were better than riprap. And so, there's always issues to address, and there's always things to improve upon, but I definitely have always maintained this perspective that I believe the arc is always towards the positive. And I've seen this not only just in the way that we do as people, the way we do work within the river. I think Flood Control 10 has been a really awesome example of that. They've continually worked with the parties to target issues and have greater ground support to avoid reds and not remove every leaner, and use conveyor belts to move gravels, and also in the way that road crossings and engineering industries have come about. I haven't seen actions such as, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but a common way to improve conveyance was just to shove another CMP through the road crossing. And, just they were called, I think, like double barrels or shotgun culverts. And those aren't inherently bad, but they do have different effects. And just the industries are improving to a point where BMPs are so common, where when I started, I was still having discussions on whether or not they could just use straw bales to control turbidity. And so there's a lot of things industry-wise and growth-wise that I think everyone on this chat is aware of. But I don't lose sight on how positive I see the trend of not just the regulations, but the regulated public and the industries embracing and kind of growing with the times to eliminate a lot of issues and discussions that I haven't had in years, just because they're just part of the baseline now. And so over time, I think the strategic vision is where communities, can start to look and observe their upstream neighbors and downstream and see what's been working, what are effects they maybe could avoid. But overall, I actually keep an optimistic approach on the quality of the work and the way the work occurs. All right, if there's nothing else, I am 11 minutes overdue on my other meetings. They can wait, though. If anyone has any other questions, more than happy to answer a couple more.
Or can they email them to you? Would that work?
Yeah, always. Yeah, reach out anytime. I will apologize ahead in advance. There's only like 10 of us for the whole state. I try to respond as fast as I can, but we definitely get a lot of calls. So email is always best. My voicemail blows up. Sometimes I don't get to all of them. So.
Marve, it is always a pleasure to work with you. Thank you for presenting today. It's a pleasure to see you present as well and to see your skills. I'd like to remind everyone that this is one of many Riverside chats that Brent has hosted throughout the year. And Marissa Keith is largely responsible for making this happen. I'd like to express a word of gratitude for Marissa's work with us. She is our coordinator. And stay tuned. Next year, starting in January, we'll be looking at more Riverside chats, including one that'll describe to you some of the work the city of Boise is doing to ensure the quality of water in the Boise River remains pristine. And we'll be talking in particular about the monitoring of mussel populations as biological indicators of the health of the river. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. It's a pleasure to work with you.
Take care, everybody. I'm dropping offline.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tiedemann. Thank you, everyone, for sitting in. I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom call now.